This is how I track accommodations for students in my classes. I've got an example here of some accommodations for Hogwarts characters. So if you look at this, the first thing we have to do is establish a data table. And in my data table, I have their name. And it's always exactly the same. You can use the fill down functions to make multiple rows, and that makes life easy. Then the next thing is I have their class period number. The next thing is their actual class name. And then in column D, I have a short description. This is a functional description of the accommodation that reminds me what I'm doing for this student. And then the long description, which is the accommodation that is on their paperwork. That way I can keep track of what was actually, kind of the details. And then I also add a column for, is this accommodation specific for testing or not? So is it something that I need to be aware of during a test? So those are the columns I've found most helpful. Let me talk about that functional description a little more. One of the ones I use a lot is CFU, which is check for understanding. And in some of the accommodations, this might be things like repeat instructions, ask the students to repeat the instructions, give the instructions in multiple modes, that sort of things. So to me, functionally, that means check for understanding, and I kind of do that in all the ways. Then I also distinguish between students that get access to notes and hard copy of notes. So those are some of the things that I kind of put in there. Once you have your data table constructed and you've got everything uniform across for every student, we are going to select all of the rows. So I'm going to choose the first cell. I'm hitting Shift Control down arrow and right arrow. And that lets me select the entire table. Notice that it ends at row 146 in my example. Then I'm going to choose Data, and we're going to select Pivot Table. And right here, notice it stops at row 140, the end of that. I'm going to make that 500. That way I can set this table to include a bunch of blank rows. So as I make changes to this table, adding students, adding accommodations, it's not going, my pivot table is going to continue to work. Okay, and we're going to choose to make this pivot table on a new sheet. If you haven't used pivot tables before, they're extremely powerful. The key is having that database set up. So you have rows, columns, values, and filters. So the rows I want to add in this order, I'm going to have the class period first. I'm going to add another row, the class, and then the final row is going to be the name of the student. For the columns, we're going to add in the short description because this is kind of the short information to me that I kind of put, where I put a lot of descriptions into like a short name that reminds me of what I'm supposed to do. And then for the values, we want to use the short description. So it's going to count the student and the short descriptions, and that tells you where you need to apply that. Another filter in this case I would add is based on for testing, and the only values I have in there are yes or no, so I'm going to unselect everything except test, and this would give me a list of accommodations by student that are for testing only. Okay, now that I've got my pivot table configured on this side, I can look at the output here. I'm going to expand this column, so let's say we're going to give a test in this course, Defense Against the Dark Arts. So these students are going to go to Content Mastery. This one gets verbal directions, and you can just go across here and see who gets what accommodations. So small group testing, that sort of thing. Okay, and that's where this is really powerful. You can collapse this by period, and that way you can just look at the ones that are of interest to you. So pivot tables are extremely powerful, and this is kind of how I handle them. If you would like me to help you get this set up, let me know.